think we're good. All right, so hello everyone. Thank you for attending our actually last general meeting of the semester. It's been a really great time. We've had a lot of great guest speakers, and save the best for last. Miss Gretchen Fowles with the NJDEP is going to be talking about her work with the CHANJ program. But before we delve into her presentation, I'm just going to go over some quick announcements that you guys might be interested in. So before the semester kind of ends, we're going to plan one more field trip that might be of interest to you. And we are thinking of going to Cape May to see the cool kind of shorebirds and winter migration birds that are kind of there right now. So mark your calendars for Tuesday, December 14th. It's a reading day, so you hopefully won't have any classes or exams during that period, but we're going to be sending out a form shortly to ask if you are available and if you have a car and are willing to carpool. And it's going to be a similar process to how we selected people to attend the Saw-Whet Owl banding trip. So just keep your eyes posted in the email for that. And the last announcement that I have is that our election interest form, which was sent out by Connor, he'll send it out again in the next newsletter, is due next Tuesday, December 7th. And then starting December 7th, we will hold online elections for the people who express interest in running for a position. So just be sure to fill that out if you're interested in joining our awesome team. And we're really looking forward to working with all of you guys next semester to make RU Wildlife even better. So enough of that. And without further ado, Miss Gretchen Fowles, please take it away.
Okay, hi everybody. Yes, thanks for the invite. I'm Gretchen Fowles. I'm a biologist with the Division of Fish and Wildlife's Endangered and Non-Game Species Program. And my job with the program is a few things. One, I manage our rare species database. I study a couple specific species, bobcats and the Allegheny wood rat. And I work on this habitat connectivity project that I'm excited to share with you today. So let me attempt to get this going for you. Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is this CHANJ project, and CHANJ stands for Connecting Habitat Across New Jersey. It's a project we released just in the past couple of years, so it's a fairly new project. And the idea behind it is really pretty simple, that basically wildlife need to be able to move through the landscape to find food, mates, other resources, and if they don't have that ability to move, their populations are in jeopardy. So when we think about the threats to our terrestrial wildlife in New Jersey, the one that never fails to rise to the top is this issue of habitat fragmentation from urbanization and roads. New Jersey, as you might be aware, has the densest human population of any state in the country. It's got steady growth as well to show for that. The red is a map developed by the CRISA lab, actually there at Rutgers, and the developed lands there in red, and you can see that kind of gobbling up the natural land and habitat over time. And we also have a very dense network of roads, as you can see on the map on the right, with high volume roads, so those roads with over 10,000 vehicles a day showing up in red. So you can see how they just very much crisscross the whole state, making it difficult for wildlife to be able to move. And so we know the direct effects of roads on wildlife is that they cause mortality from vehicles hitting them trying to cross, but they also can be significant barriers to movement. So if we take a look at these bobcats that we've had collared over time, each colored cluster of points represent a different bobcat that had a collar on for about a year's time. And you can see the influence of those roads, particularly those high volume roads, that those roads have on their range of movements. They seem to be kind of very much kind of dictating their movement patterns. And it's even more evident when we look at one particularly in automated. So this is a female that was collared a couple years ago. And when we animate her movement over time, you can just see how kind of crunched she is by that main road, which is Route 15 up in northern New Jersey. And ultimately, this movement barrier can result in genetic consequences. And unfortunately, we have our first evidence of this occurring in New Jersey, with major roads being identified as a major cause for the state endangered timber rattlesnake population isolation in the Pine Barrens, where populations on either side of roads in that area are genetically different. So that's definitely what we want to avoid. The good news is that New Jersey's invested a lot over the years in preserving land. Over the third of the state is actually preserved, which is really quite impressive, particularly when we say those stats, at regional conferences or national conferences. Folks are always extremely impressed by that, not the impression, that they have of New Jersey. But to maximize this investment that we've made, we really need to make sure that these areas that we've protected aren't left as disconnected islands, but instead are all elements of a functionally connected network of habitats. So what we found ourselves asking a few years ago was, how can we integrate and promote habitat connectivity considerations into our land and transportation planning, particularly since we only have so much left, so much area that's left undeveloped. We have to be particularly strategic. We realized that we were just lacking some kind of basic fundamental tools in order to really get started addressing this issue in any kind of thoughtful way. So what is CHANJ exactly? It consists of two main products. One is a mapping tool that identifies and characterizes habitat cores and corridors that are critical for long-term survival of terrestrial species. And these layers are available as an interactive map application that I'll show you, as well as downloadable layers as GIS web services, and then on our New Jersey GeoWeb, if you're familiar with that online web mapping application as well. And the second product is a guidance document that offers recommendations for how to protect, manage, and restore those lands, including creating safe passageways through roads that run through the habitat cores and corridors. And the guidance document is linked interactively to the mapping, which I'll show you. So in a nutshell, CHANJ provides tools and resources to guide land protection, habitat management and restoration, and the mitigation of road barriers. So we have a website that's kind of our one-stop shop for CHANJ. The URL is at the top there. And kind of in the middle of the page there, we have these links to those two main products, the mapping and the guidance document. And I'll point out just above that as well, there's a, here are the two links. And just above that, there's a little intro video, just a couple-minute video that gives kind of a synopsis of what the CHANJ project is about. So let's delve into the guidance document. So it's broken up into 5 chapters, starting with an introduction that gives kind of the rationale for developing the project and offers a good background, I think, on the importance of habitat connectivity, particularly as it comes to climate change, adaptation, et cetera. The second chapters talks about the methodology we used for the mapping, the GIS layers we used, the modeling we used, et cetera, kind of lays that out in that chapter. The next chapter, the third chapter, is the connectivity assessments chapter. So the idea here is that with this initial mapping that we developed a couple years ago, this now serves as sort of a baseline to evaluate landscape connectivity metrics over time at different scales to chart our progress. So our release of version 1 serves as our baseline, and then we calculated various numeric and road and habitat related metrics. I know this is charts hard to see, but these are a bunch of road metrics. We created habitat metrics at this statewide scale, and then at these regional scales across the state. And these are metrics that we plan to track over time as we continually update the mapping. And I just wanted to point out, this is the map broken up into the regions that we use for our landscape project mapping and this project as well. And the map on the right shows that connectivity network that we've mapped out using CHANJ, and just wanted to highlight that central region, the Piedmont, and just what a concern it is to us. You can see it pretty clearly, even at this statewide scale, that to the north, and then certainly in the Pinelands region, we have lots of nice intact core habitat. But in the Piedmont, the cores are much smaller, those darker green areas, and the corridors between them are much longer and more spindly. And so this is a concern. And certainly as a bobcat biologist, this is a concern to me, because bobcats are kind of stuck in northern New Jersey. The population up there is doing pretty well, but we have very few, if any, records in central and southern New Jersey. And a big part of this, I think, is related to habitat, the lack of habitat connectivity, those major highways, and just this really urbanized area that we have through central New Jersey between Philadelphia and New York City, which is great for people to move through, but really a difficult gauntlet for wildlife to make it through. So that Piedmont region is definitely one that we're focusing a fair amount of energy on. The fourth chapter in the guidance document is kind of the heart of the guidance as it relates to land protection, habitat management, and road mitigation. It talks about thoughts on prioritizing actions and offers state and local resources for habitat work. And also an important part of this chapter are best management practices for road crossing structures. So we have a list of 127 native terrestrial species that are target species for this CHANJ project. And we have them broken up into guilds. And then we have these best management practices for road crossing structures divided up by these different guilds of species, all based on best available science, and the references are all listed at the end of the chapter. And so these are more of those specs, both for the crossing structure itself, the fencing that guides animals to the structure and prevents them from going up on the roadway. And then we have diagrams as well that kind of illustrate what we mean by these specs, what they actually look like implemented in kind of a cartoon drawing form, with the different important elements marked and explained in these diagrams. The fifth chapter is related to action teams. This is something we're still working on as a way to kind of better coordinate habitat and road conservation actions in a given area for folks, for instance, in that Piedmont region, to know what other land protection folks, road agencies, et cetera, are working on there, so that projects hopefully can start piggybacking on top of each other. And then we have appendices at the end with different protocols we're using for camera monitoring, road kill surveys, et cetera. So now I'll delve into the CHANJ web viewer. So this is our online mapping application that's publicly available. Again, you can access it from that link on the CHANJ website. And I won't go through all the functions on here. I'm sure you've seen a lot of these web maps over the course of your studies, etc. Each is a little bit different, but they have the same essential tools. I just thought I'd point out a couple basic things about this one. One is this, this information icon on the right. We've tried to make as useful as possible. At the top of it, it offers a user guide and links to video tutorials on how to get started with the mapping, which I think is really useful. There are quite a number of layers in here that it helps to have. I'm going to go through them now with you, but you know, helps to have another way of kind of walking you through those layers and what they represent. And so it also does that. It details the change specific layers that we developed as part of this project, provides that list here. And then wanted to point out too, this near me button, which will take you to your current location. And so I personally find this really nice to have available on my phone. So if I'm in an area hiking or doing some work, to be able to pull up the change mapping and better understand my habitat connectivity context, you know, right where I'm standing is really a neat way to better understand that context. Okay, so now let's delve into the change specific layers a little bit. The fundamental mapping layer is the one called change. So the change data sets composed of 3 different components: cores, corridors. So the cores are in green, corridors are in brown, and then road segments. So the green areas, the cores, are patches of contiguous natural land cover. The corridors are different shades of brown, and they represent swaths of habitat that are the most efficient movement routes between cores based on cost-weighted distance is the modeling we used. And if you click on an area in a core, a pop-up window comes up that gives you that particular feature's unique ID. You'll see a link as well that takes you to the section of the guidance document that talks about prioritization decisions and resources available to help with habitat acquisition and habitat management. So the road segments are black and gray segments of roads within the cores and corridors that don't have urbanized land on either side of them. So we like to call these opportunities for conservation. They're locations where it may be beneficial to increase safe passage for wildlife through the road because it has habitat on both sides of it, you know, based on our modeling. So if we take a closer look, for instance, at this area, you can see it has 3 of those road segments, and they're broken down by level of road. So the black are severe barriers. These are high volume highways that are over 10,000 vehicles a day. The slightly lighter shade of gray are county roads and highways with less than 10,000 vehicles a day. And then the real light gray are secondary roads. Okay, so if we zoom in now to that area and take a closer look, you can see as I turn on the aerials in the back, and then I'll turn off the mapping. If you keep your eye on those black road segments, you can see that those are the last opportunities through that corridor where there's not urbanized land. There's a number of houses in the mix on one or both sides of the road. And so what this modeling did was find the areas again where there's natural land cover on both sides of that road segment, because you don't want to invest in a road crossing if you're just going to have the wildlife go from habitat into a parking lot, for instance. So this helps kind of filter those areas a bit. And then if we zoom back out, and here's another road segment, if we click on that road segment, again, a pop-up window comes up that gives some basic information about that road segment. and then again, a link, and that link takes you to the section of the guidance document that has those best management practices. So those specs on building the most effective wildlife crossing based on, you know, the guilds of species you're talking about. So we've also built a number of additional layers to help with decision making. For instance, we built a layer called stepping stones. So these are these areas, as I turn them on and off, in light green, whoops, in the cores and corridors that are really similar to the core areas. It's just that they're located within cores and corridors, and they have a smaller threshold size than the core, the darker green core areas do. We also have layers representing preserved land, as that's a really important consideration when planning connectivity work. All of the preserved land is in yellow, and then we've taken an extra step of filtering out those lands in yellow that are permanently protected and have wildlife value. So it kind of filters out the ball fields, for instance, and these are areas in dark green that we call terrestrial wildlife preserved land, just as a little more nuance to help with planning. We also have a layer in here, and it's a New Jersey specific, it's called a NAC culvert inventory coverage. So NAC stands for the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Collaborative. It's a bit of a mouthful. That's a program that's run by University of Massachusetts, and New Jersey is one of 13 states that are part of that network, wherein culvert inventories are conducted using standardized methodology. And the measurements that are taken during those inventories are run through an algorithm that then scores the structure as to how passable it's likely to be by terrestrial wildlife, from a severe barrier that's symbolized in red to no barrier in blue. And so far, we have over 400 of these assessments done, and there's only, I just looked at this, about 17% that are have a no barrier, insignificant barrier, or minor barrier. So the vast majority of culverts, you know, just weren't built with terrestrial wildlife in mind, and they're pretty difficult for terrestrial wildlife to use. So that's something that we're working on as well, as I'll show you. So if we zoom into an area a bit, we can take a look at a couple of these culverts that have had assessments done. For instance, if we look at this yellow one, so that is a moderate barrier culvert. If you click on the culvert in the mapping, a pop-up window comes up again with a little bit of information, a link, and then that link takes you to the NAC regional database and takes you to information that's in that database on that culvert from that assessment, including pictures, for instance, of what that culvert looks like. So you can see why this is kind of a moderate barrier culvert. There's some wildlife certainly that would be able to navigate through that just fine, raccoons, etc. It's got some dry passage underneath. Deer might have a little bit of trouble because it's quite short, and they'd want to, deer tend to like areas that are just a bit more open, and certainly not have to kind of crouch through to get through. But additionally, from that link and in that database, you can find the actual measurements, for instance, that were taken, etc. So that's a really neat tool. If we look at one more, so this is a red one. So this means it's a severe barrier structure is what it came out as. And again, if we click on that link and take a look at it, yeah, you can see that it's just a round circular culvert, inundated with water, no dry area, quite small. There's not many terrestrial wildlife species that are going to navigate through that successfully. Another layer that we have in the mapping is one that's called Road Wildlife Mitigation Database. So these are road projects that have either been constructed or are in progress. So in other words, they've been permitted to be constructed and will be, but they haven't yet been put in the ground. So the constructed ones are in blue, the gray are the permitted projects. So this layer represents our central repository of projects built or to be built with wildlife passage in mind over time. So going back to the 70s and 80s in New Jersey. And just to go back to that map for a second, you can see that there's quite a few, maybe more than you thought, certainly more than I thought, and a lot of gray ones too, a lot just quite recently. And the reason for that is that a couple of years ago, there was a new kind of amendment to our Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules, which required terrestrial passage to be considered when a culvert was being replaced or put in new in an area where habitat was being habitat for terrestrial species, particularly threatened, endangered, special concern species, was being fragmented. So it's a lot of, caveats there, but as a result, this list of species are, the lists that often get tagged as part of this regulation. And there's quite a number of crossings that have been permitted as a result of this, this new requirement. So if we, and the other nice thing about this requirement is that it also has a consideration there for fencing. That's a kind of an essential part of a lot of these crossings, that you can't just put in an overpass or an underpass, a nice opening, without having some fencing involved, like I mentioned before, that helps filter the animals to the structure and keeps them off the road. There's been a number of studies that have found just what an essential component, and logically, that makes sense. So this requirement does have that incorporated in it, as well as needing to considering that fencing component. So if we go back to that layer I showed you, and we look at one of these in progress points, again, if you click on the point when you're zoomed in, you get some basic information about the project. And then you get a link at the bottom. In this case, it's an image of an amphibian crossing system that's going to be built in this location, hopefully next year. It keeps getting delayed a little bit for a variety of reasons, but where there'll be 4 different crossing structures put in with a network of barriers that are leading the amphibians to those structures that will safely take the amphibians help them migrate from their overwintering grounds in the upland habitat to this vernal pool where they breed every spring. So there's this mass amphibian migration, likely the biggest in the state, that we're now fortunately going to be able to provide a permanent solution for, rather than having people out on the roads in the middle of a rainy night, including myself, helping to, shuttle these amphibians across the road to try to keep that population going. And so now if we put these pieces, all these different mapping layers together a little bit, we can kind of see the information we can glean from it. So here we have a nice wide corridor. This is in the Sourlands area in kind of north central New Jersey. And this is a site of a retrofit project a couple of years ago, where dry passage shelves were installed for a terrestrial wildlife crossing as part of a permit application. So if we take a look at this, it's blue because it's been constructed. And previously this bridge existed, but it was pure water from side to side. And so there's a lot of terrestrial wildlife that aren't going to want to wade through water to get through the road. They're just going to be much more apt to go take their chances, I guess, and go up over top the road. So as a result of this permit, they're required to put in these shelves on either side of the structure to provide that dry passage. The only problem with this one still remaining is that if we put on our preserved land layers, you can see the land on both sides of that structure is not preserved. It's privately owned, which might be fine if we can work with those landowners and let them understand, that importance of that crossing. But in an ideal world, that would be preserved so that we know that that'll be a safe place for wildlife to get, it'll remain habitat, and wildlife will be able to, for a long term, be able to get through from side to side of that busy county road. And yeah, I put in some pictures we were monitoring this for a bit to see what wildlife was using it, and it's quite a number of different species that were picked up on cameras. I will note that these blocks, let me go back to that first one especially, these blocks, what should have happened in this situation, and this is because we're a bit, we have a lot of work to do in terms of educating engineers and planners about these wildlife crossings and these specs. But what should have happened is these blocks should have been filled in with soil so that natural vegetation can grow on them, and then they'd just be a much more seamless part of the landscape rather than having holes that, like a hooved animal especially, would have trouble navigating through. So with each of these projects that go in the ground, we're trying to look critically at them and figure out how each iteration we can do better and better. This is just another quick example of, we've got a core area in the lighter green. The darker green is the preserved land, that's the terrestrial wildlife habitat preserved land. So should be nice habitat for terrestrial wildlife, but you can see on those couple roads where culverts have been assessed, they're bright red. So they're severe barrier structures. So these are ones that would be great to look at more closely, perhaps put cameras out, but more likely maybe do some roadkill surveys in that area to see how severe of an impact those areas are. And then hopefully we can rectify that by the next time those culverts are up to be replaced, we can get ones that are more friendly for wildlife through those areas. And just another example, this is kind of that spindly area I was mentioning in the Piedmont region. We've got 3 corridors here. Each of them has road segments mapped in them, which is actually a good sign. It means that there's habitat on both sides and there's an opportunity there to increase, safe passage through those corridors, especially where those roads are crossing. The black dots are culverts that exist, but have not been assessed yet. And we're encouraging folks that are trained in this NAC methodology to be surveying for culverts in change mapped areas. So there are culverts in those locations, which again are opportunities. It's much easier to retrofit, modify an existing structure than put a whole new structure in the ground in terms of expense and logistics, et cetera. And if we zoom into this one in the upper right here and take a closer look at the land, there's quite a bit of preserved land actually throughout that corridor, which is fantastic and not often the case. So we've got a lot of the preserved land in general, and then especially that terrestrial wildlife habitat preserved land. Again, we've got a couple opportunities there of culverts and mapped road segments, meaning there's habitat on both sides of those structures. It's hard to see in this map, but there's a stepping stone in there, which means that that area within the corridor is a little bit more intact. So it might be live-in habitat for a number of less mobile species. And then, there's some areas of the corridor that still could use some protection. There's some areas that are also not the dark green, not the terrestrial wildlife habitat preserved land. So maybe it could be a matter of working with some folks to acquire that land that's not protected, and the areas that are protected but not considered terrestrial wildlife habitat based on our definition, work with the land managers to make the habitat management practices that they're using more hospitable for terrestrial wildlife. So again, in a nutshell, CHANJ is the set of tools and resources to guide land protection, habitat management, restoration, and mitigation of road barriers. We have a couple, what we feel it gives us for the first time is a common vision of New Jersey's connectivity puzzle. This was something we just didn't have before, and land managers and folks working on land protection and highway engineers didn't have, that we now all have and is accessible to everybody. It's usable at local and statewide scales and enables more proactive and collaborative planning. We have a couple additional tools that are in the works. One is called NJ Wildlife Trackers. This is a mobile-friendly website that folks can use to collect roadkill data or rare species data from their phone or on their computer, and allows for much more streamlined data entry into our rare species database, as well as enables us to evaluate these roadkill hotspots a lot better if we have a whole bunch of folks out there collecting roadkill data for us to better understand where those hotspots are. We have road segment reports that we're working on where we're summarizing information within these road segments to help prioritize ones to focus on. And then an action team web application, like I mentioned before, to help coordinate work among partners a little bit better. I thought I'd go back to the website just for a second and point out that we have an email list where you can sign up and receive. They should be more frequent. They're not as frequent as we'd like sometimes, but it's a listserv where we have a document that's a page or two that just kind of keeps you in the loop of the latest happenings on the CHANJ project or other news that's coming out. We have one that's about to come out, for instance, on the new Infrastructure Act that just was signed into law, and it has within it $350 million set aside for wildlife crossing work, like historically huge amount. So there's a lot of excitement about that. We were excited to be part of a PBS episode called Wildlife Crossings the last year or two. It talks about, working on road mitigation for wildlife on the East Coast, and New Jersey's represented in kind of the second half of the video. You can find that on our webpage. There's a link to it down here. And wanted to mention that there's a couple conferences dedicated to this topic of road ecology. One is International Conference on Ecology and Transportation. It's international, but it's always held in the US. This past September, it was virtual, but it's going to be held in Vermont, in Burlington, in the fall of 2023. It's a fantastic conference. And then this Northeast Transportation and Wildlife Conference dedicated to just the Northeast region of the US. There was a conference in the fall of 2020, and actually all the recorded presentations are available online if you go to their website, freely available. And we're actually hosting it for the first time, hopefully in person in the fall of 2022 in September. This is the URL. It's netwick.org, where you can find more information on that conference. And there's a little teaser video there of work that we're doing in New Jersey on this topic as well, to get folks excited about it. And yeah, so this is the URL to the website, and then we have an dedicated email for the project too. And that's all I've got. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. So people who are tuning in on Zoom, feel free to type your questions in the chat. I'll just moderate, but does anyone in the room right now have any questions that they'd like to ask? I do have one question while we're waiting for some Zoom people to type in. So you mentioned that there is a mandate that requires some of these wildlife crossings to be built, under culverts that were deemed not very good for wildlife passage. Is there any way that private homeowners or even just citizens could request a wildlife crossing to be built in an area? So like perhaps it wasn't mandated, but they just see that there's a lot of roadkill mortality and they think that they should do something about it?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's certainly, as part of our program, we're collecting information like that. What really helps is to have the data. So if there's an area like that, where you're concerned about roadkill and think it's a mortality hotspot, like anything, like I said, it's helpful to have the data. So if someone were willing to conduct a roadkill survey that would really help collecting those data. And I mentioned that NJ Wildlife Tracker application that's coming out. That'd be another way to collect data and just highlight that area. But we're happy to, kind of have that on our radars too. We kind of have a list of road segments that folks have mentioned to us as being problematic, that, we kind of maintain this informal list at least.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? Another question that I had was, so sometimes these road structures or culverts, they get, maintained every now and then. So are there any mandates that require, I guess, these structures that are being maintained to add like retrofitted wildlife crossing structures, or is that kind of like still in the works?
Yeah, so there's a requirement that I mentioned, but it's for culverts that are being replaced. So it has to be, pretty significant work, not just being maintained, but put in new or replaced. And that's where that regulation comes in, where they need to consider terrestrial passage through them. But there are cases like that amphibian crossing system I mentioned, where there aren't really existing crossings there. We recognize that as a really significant area in the state, and then applied for grants ourselves to get that done. So that's another mechanism we use. And with this new Infrastructure Act, there'll be more opportunities like that, more grants available to do work like that in these areas that are high concern for us.
Are most of these structures paid for by a grant?
I didn't quite hear that.
I can ask. So
Okay.
Joe asked if most of these structures, the construction of them, are they paid for by grants?
Yes, I guess is the short answer. A lot of them are through counties or this state DOT, and they receive their funding from the Federal Highway Administration. So in that way, I guess it's federal funding, but in terms of actually applying for grants specific to it, we've been able to take advantage, again, for that amphibian crossing system and Waterloo Road. That was a grant called it's this transportation alternatives program for, like, wildlife crossings are one of, I don't know, a dozen different types of projects that can be funded through that grant. So it's this competitive grant that we applied for and succeeded in getting. But yeah, so most are federal funds filtered through the state. And then there's this other grant program. And like I said, a very big grant program, you know, just about starting now as part of that new law.
Do you know how much it costs to build those 4 structures you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. I believe the total, I think it's somewhere in the range of $200,000 to $300,000. It's not inexpensive, you know, by the time they dig that out, the materials, the cost for engineering plans as well for the barriers, they do add up. There are, I should mention too, in Vermont and California is this way with that mountain lion overpass that you may have seen. Some of these projects in other states have been crowdsourced, where they're, you know, just get big donors to help make them happen as well. But yeah, the underpasses are a lot less expensive than the overpasses, certainly, but there's a big effort across the US and internationally to really decrease those costs of the overpasses, because they are so incredibly successful, especially out west with some of those like pronghorn migrations and such. They've been incredibly successful and just blend right into the landscape on both sides, but they're so prohibitively expensive that they're difficult to implement. So at least that's now recognized, and there's a lot of engineers and such working on really trying to reduce those costs. And that's why retrofitting too is another way, where if they're going to be replacing that structure anyway, many times the modifications that need to be made for terrestrial wildlife don't increase the cost by very much at all, particularly given the cost of the project as it is quite expensive. And so it could add a couple % or something to the project, but those piggybacking onto a project that's already happening for other reasons tends to be a pretty successful way to go about it.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions from the chat or in the room? So you mentioned that volunteers can help a lot with the construction of some of these wildlife crossings. Are there really easy ways for people to get involved, either with the construction of the crossing themselves? I know you mentioned that citizen science is a big part of the roadkill surveys as well, but like, what would you say is the easiest way that someone interested could get involved?
Yeah, I think one great way that I know I do myself around where I live is just taking a look at that mapping and getting familiar with what the mapping's showing, where culverts are mapped within cores and corridors, taking a look at those culverts, that NAC culvert inventory. That's it involves online training, an online module and test, and Montclair State University is actually the state coordinators for that. So it involves this online component and then this in the field component. And, you know, that is something we could certainly use more of as folks that are trained in that methodology. And it's a neat, you know, for students, sort of a nice resume builder too, because it is a methodology, like I said, that's being conducted across a 13 state region. So it's not just applicable to a really localized scale, but to, you know, gain a better understanding of the culverts that are in the ground and what the story with them is. And then, yeah, these roadkill surveys, it could either be informal. This NJ Wildlife Tracker application will be out in the next couple months, hopefully. that's a way to do those surveys informally, or you could be in touch with us and we could talk through like a more formal protocol for those roadkill surveys. Like I said, in that change guidance document, there's a protocol that we follow for those surveys.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Who is your team who is working on this with you? Sorry if you couldn't hear that.
He asked, how large is the team working with you?
There are 3 of us in our endangered and non-game species program that are working on this, in addition to other things we're all working on. But we do meet every other month with this Roads and Wildlife Working Group, where we meet with DOT, folks within DEP that are the permit folks, someone from US Fish and Wildlife Service, to talk about this and upcoming roads projects. And otherwise, just a lot of partners. The Nature Conservancy, for instance, is a big partner that we talk to a lot about how they could use the tools for habitat acquisition, et cetera. So it's just a couple of us within our program, but there's quite a few partners that are, and it's building all the time.
Okay, thank you so much. So it is 6:54. So if there are no final questions, I just wanted to say thank you so much for presenting to us. It was super engaging. We all really enjoyed your presentation. Just a quick plug, I have seen the Wildlife Crossing PBS documentary, and it is highly recommend that you check it out.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this spring we're actually just talking about this, but we were planning on maybe seeing if we could help out as a chapter with the amphibian crossing that's up in Sussex County. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely stay tuned. And just one last reminder for the people who might not have been here at 6 o'clock sharp, we have a Cape May birding trip that will be held on Tuesday, December 14th. So keep checking your emails for that. And if you're interested in running for a position on the executive board, you must fill out the form by next Tuesday, December 7th. And that's pretty much all that we have for today. So if we could all just give one last final round of applause to Ms. Gretchen Fowles. And yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the presentation.
Great, thank you. And good luck with the end of your semesters. I know how stressful that is.
Thank you so much. All right, have a good night.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.